This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
I'm Jim Hamilton. I'm a professor in the Economics department here at UCSD and chair of our Roundtable steering committee. And it's my pleasure to welcome each of you to our second meeting of the 2009 series for the Economics Roundtable. In just a moment, I'll introduce today's speaker. So today's topic is under the Obama administration, hope and change in education. Our speaker is Julian Betts, who's professor and chair of the economics department and one of the world's foremost authorities on economics and education. He's written extensively on the consequences of variables like public school spending, including class size, teacher salaries, teachers' levels of education, what difference they make for student outcomes. Most recently, he's been conducting some exciting research on the role that standards and school choice play in student achievement. He's written many more books than I could possibly even read for you right now. Some of the recent titles include Does School Choice Work? Effects on Student Integration and Achievement, From Blueprint to Reality, San Diego's Education Reform, and Equal Resources, Equal Outcomes, the Distribution of School Resources and Student Achievement in California. Those are just a few of the many contributions. He's an adjunct fellow of the Public Policy Institute of California, a research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a member of the technical review panel for several national studies, include the studies of No Child Left Behind and the Washington, D.C. school voucher experiment. He obtained his bachelor's degree in chemistry from McGill University. So this is one economist who actually knows how to make stuff. And his PhD in economics from Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. So please join me in welcoming Julian Betts.
Well, good morning, and thank you all for coming out so early to see this today. What I want to talk to you about this morning is hope and change. We heard a lot about hope and change during the previous election. How does that apply to education? And what is the Obama administration aiming to do? So let me start out here by just telling you some of the highlights, not all of the highlights, but the big highlights as to what President Obama has promised the nation. First of all, he has promised a very large increase in spending for the U.S. Department of Education to the tune of $44 billion. It's remarkable. I think if I'd said that a year ago, jaws would have been dropping around the room. Somehow today, $44 billion doesn't sound big, but it's a lot of money. This represents about a 2/3 increase in the U.S. Department of Education budget. One of the main slogans that we've seen bandied about in D.C. recently has been the idea that every single high school student in this nation should be prepared to go to college academically and should have the financial means to attend college and succeed. I think President Obama surprised some of his supporters in the strength of his support for charter schools. Charter schools are schools that are freed from most of the state education code and are supposed to be engines of innovation and experimentation. He's called for expanded aid at the federal level for charter schools, especially to build facilities. He's asked states to lift the numerical caps on the number of charter schools. And he's also, at the same time, called for stronger accountability in the sense of it's important that we identify charter schools that are not making the grade and that we shut those schools down. He's also come out opposing educational vouchers. So vouchers refer to public money that goes to individual families and can be used to attend private school of the student's choice. And unlike President Bush, he opposes vouchers. He's very strong on accountability, the idea of testing and content standards. He does want to reform NCLB, No Child Left Behind, and its accountability provisions and to improve those. And another somewhat surprising stance is that he is very strong on the idea of teacher merit pay, finding better ways to reward teachers. The way we pay teachers right now is fundamentally a function of A, the level of education, B, the credentials that a teacher has, and C, the number of years that a person has been teaching in the given district. And research shows that those things are not very strongly related to teaching effectiveness. So he wants to introduce some form of merit pay. And a number of individual cities around the country and states are starting to experiment with this now. So what I want to do today is to talk about hope and change. So first of all, to what extent do these policies really represent dramatic change, a break with the past? And second, given the research evidence that we have, would these reforms actually lead to better schools? Because that's really the point of all of this in the end. The first point I want to make is that it's hard to believe that you're going to have substantial changes in U.S. education unless the federal government is a very big player in K-12 education. So here is, this is the most recent set of figures available. In 2005-2006, you'll see that state and local funding accounted for the vast majority of funding of K-12. The federal government accounted for 9.1% of K-12 funding. If we extend this out, make it K-16, so we look at college education as well, the federal role does increase. It's 12.1% overall of national spending on K through college. So that should give you pause. The federal government, to some extent, really is a bully pulpit rather than a lever to affect vast changes in public schools. So the next thing I want to touch upon is the question of whether the themes that President Obama has touched upon are really new themes, breaks with the past, or not. So let me start with one of his most controversial statements from a recent speech he gave in March. You can see here he says, "We're seeing that children from all walks of life can and will achieve when we set high standards, have high expectations. When we do a good job preparing them, we will cultivate a new culture of accountability in schools." So this seems quite radical. Our decades-old fixation with things like class size, professional development for teachers, getting the curriculum right, and just letting teachers do their thing, he's saying that's not the whole equation. We also need to look at accountability and incentives, and surely there's no U.S. president who's ever said anything like that. Well, okay, except for President Bush, who said essentially exactly the same thing. But that's just the most recent two presidents. This is a theme of the new millennium. This is something that never came before in U.S. education. Well, Bill Clinton said something a little bit like that too. But surely this started with Bill Clinton. Well, that's all I could fit on one slide. But you get the point. So obviously I'm having a lot of fun with this. Accountability, standards, incentives, these are things that at least the last four presidents have really focused on. Just because President Obama is not being particularly original in focusing on this doesn't mean that this is not a good idea. So later in the talk, I'll tell you what we know about accountability and whether accountability actually improves outcomes for students. So on this slide, what I'm showing you is the checklist of the main things that I want to talk about from President Obama's policy agenda. So let's start with the stimulus spending. The first thing to note is that $44 billion is a lot of money, but it's being spent on a one-time basis. And one thing that really stands out in my memory is this quotation right here. In Sacramento, I heard someone say that, how can we really affect fundamental reforms when we're about to fall off a cliff? And there's a lot of rhetoric in DC right now about how this spending is going to completely transform public education. You know, the truth, I think, really is that this spending is primarily meant to prevent tens of thousands of teacher layoffs. And people in Sacramento and people in a number of districts I've talked to say that this is really just postponing for 1 year what may happen next year, which is widespread layoffs in the teaching profession, unless the economy improves and dramatically. The Obama administration has received some criticism, I think rightly, for not leveraging this $44 billion. Really, the emphasis here was getting the money out the doors as quickly as possible. They haven't put a lot of conditions on this spending. And that means that even though there's a lot of talk about increased accountability, expanding charter schools, and so on, yes, there's a little bit of money in this stimulus package for things like modernizing school buildings and so on, but most of it is being given to states really to bulk up their finances and to prevent teacher layoffs. President Obama has called for better academic preparation for high school students and better financial backing for college. One of the things that the administration has already done is to put Pell Grants, which for many university students is the main form of financial support, on a much more firm footing, in the sense that Congress on an annual basis cannot really monkey around with this spending any longer. And this is really important because it means if you're in grade 10 and planning for college, you know that that money is going to be there when you graduate from high school. I think that's a great idea. It's a bit less clear, at least to me, as an outside observer, what will transpire when the government tries to put in place this plan for better college preparedness. I don't really know what the administration means by this. Too often, I think, in this country, we look at, oh, the test scores are really low in grade 11. Something's wrong with grade 11. We need to effect reforms right there in grade 11. I hope that's not what this turns into, because that's a dangerously naive approach. I'm going to show you one example here. This is from a book that Andy Zhao and I just published through the Public Policy Institute of California, where we looked at the determinants of success on the California high school exit exam. And as you probably know, students starting in grade 10 have 6 or 7 chances to take this exam and to pass both the math and the English language arts components of it. If they don't pass, they don't get a high school diploma in California. So the question here is, if they're not passing, does it mean that there's something going wrong at the high school level? Well, maybe. What I'm showing you here in this graph is the results of our model, where we're trying to predict who's going to pass the KC, as it's known, by grade 12. So on this axis, what I'm showing is 10 different bins into which Andy and I put each student as of grade 9. So in this bin, we're putting people where we thought, according to our model, the probability of passing the high school exit exam by grade 12 was 90% or more. And on this axis, what we're showing is the percentage of people in that group as of grade 9 who actually did pass. And you see it's indeed a little bit over 90%. And it's almost a straight line going all the way down to this bottom group. The bottom group, according to our model, as of grade 9, when we had the grade 9 data available to us, we thought those students had less than a 5% chance of passing. Well, lo and behold, about 3% of the students in that group actually passed. So maybe there's something going wrong in grade 9, or maybe it's a few grades earlier. But let me show you something else. We reran the model, and we pretended we knew nothing about students after grade 4. We took grades, a wealth of information that San Diego Unified has in its report cards, really about student behavior and other characteristics, and we found that we could predict who was going to pass and fail the high school exit exam using grade 4 data almost as well as we could using grade 9 data. So this is just one of many examples I could have given you of the idea that if you see things going wrong with high school graduation, don't assume that the way to solve this problem is to spend a lot more money on high schools. The kids who have trouble with a high school exit exam are getting into trouble as early as grade 4. Now, one of the more radical things and surprising things for a Democrat to do is to support greatly expanded aid for charter schools, but at the same time imposing charter school accountability. And as I've already mentioned, President Obama has argued that school vouchers are not really something we should be supporting with federal money. So let me make a few comments on what we know about charter schools and voucher programs. This graph is from a paper that Emily Tang and I just published, where we reviewed all of the evidence using the best techniques out there on charter schools. And just first a comment on the research literature. Only about 1/4 of the papers that have been published on charter schools and achievement really pass muster in the sense of using convincing methods. And I'll explain why in a minute or two. What I'm showing in this graph is the results on reading. So let's look at the left-hand side of this graph first. This is showing all studies, regardless of whether they're looking at elementary, middle, or high school charter school performance. The red bars are showing studies where people found positive and significant results. Orange shows studies where the effect of attending a charter school apparently was positive, but it was not statistically significant. And then the yellow and the green are showing negative, either insignificant or significant. So when you look at this overall, it looks like it's pretty evenly balanced. If you look very closely at the data, you'll see that the preponderance of evidence suggests that charter schools are outperforming traditional public schools, but there are huge variations from one region to another. There are also big variations by grade. So in the next 3 bars in this graph, we're showing you the results of our literature review when we looked at studies of elementary schools only, middle schools, and then on the right, high schools. You'll see at the elementary school level really quite compelling evidence that at least in some areas, elementary charter schools are outperforming traditional public schools. So we have essentially almost 50% of studies showing positive and significant effects, no studies showing negative and significant effects. Things are a little bit more mixed at the middle school level, but remarkably about 90% of the studies are showing positive results. It's just that very few of those studies are showing results that we would refer to as statistically significant, in other words, meaningful. At the high school level, and here I have to be very cautious because there are very few studies anywhere of charter schools at the high school level, but the studies that do exist are quite negative and showing on the whole that charter high schools are having some trouble teaching and improving reading skills. Taken as a whole though, and we go into great detail in this in the paper, charter schools do seem to be outperforming on average. So in that context, what should we make of President Obama's calls? First of all, for lifting numerical caps on the number of charters and also for closing failing schools. Well, the cap policy, that's a state policy. Individual states pass legislation allowing charter schools to be created, and individual states decide whether there should be a numerical cap or not. So really all that the president can do here is use this bully pulpit to try to encourage states to do this. And again, this is a sign of the limited role of the federal government in K-12 education. His calls to close failing charter schools are quite heroic, I think an important statement to make. I'm quite concerned that most public school administrators, either at the district level or at the state level, don't really have the data they need to truly identify the failing charter schools. The reason for that is that most of the data that we get from state testing systems really reports on average test scores. And the average test scores at one school versus another are primarily determined by things like the relative affluence of parents at one school versus another. The single best predictor of test scores, it turns out, is parent income or some proxy for that. And it turns out that charter schools, both in California and nationwide, tend to enroll students of lower socioeconomic status. If you don't take that into account, you will consistently bias the results against charter schools because they do tend to have lower scores. Why? Because they tend to attract students from lower socioeconomic status. So there's a solution to this, and that is instead of just looking at average test scores as published in the newspaper once a year, we need to follow individual student progress and look at gains, not just the level of a student's test score, but gains from one year to the next. And the studies that Emily Tang and I focused on in that graph I just showed you show the results from a very small subset of research that's been able to actually do that. Here's one example from San Diego. This is from a paper by myself, Emily Tang, and Andy Zhao that's forthcoming in a book on co-editing with Paul Hill. And what we did in this paper was to look at San Diego test scores from 2002 through 2006, and we tried all the various methods. And this has never been done before. We wanted to show whether the method really matters. So in this first column here, what we're modeling, the so-called dependent variable, is the level of the test score for individual students. And in a model where we try to explain test scores as a function of whether you attend a charter school students score about 1% of a standard deviation lower than other students. It's actually not a statistically significant difference, but it's there. Now you'd think that this is probably caused by the bias I just mentioned, that charter school students tend to be of lower socioeconomic status. So in this model here, what we're going to do is we're going to control for student characteristics. And sure enough, what you see happening is the coefficient rises towards 0, but it's still negative. Now, the argument I just made to you a few minutes ago is that you never want to model levels of test scores. You want to look at a student's trajectory over time. When you do that, the results change quite dramatically. The sign on charter schools flips, n becomes positive, you control for student characteristics, you get a similar result. And then using the best of all probable methods, where we use student fixed effects, where essentially we no longer compare me to you, we simply compare my performance before and after I arrived at a charter school. So we're no longer comparing apples and oranges, and you get the biggest results of all. So this is sort of just one example of how wrong you can go in looking at charter school test scores and trying to infer charter school quality by looking at the level of test scores. You need to look at individual student learning over time. Now, what about vouchers? There's a pretty mixed body of literature on vouchers in cities such as New York and Milwaukee. The most prominent voucher program currently underway is the one in Washington, D.C., and the government is currently making a decision about whether to continue funding for that or not. It looks like funding is going to be cut. And that's ironic because just a few weeks ago, the latest installment of the evaluation of the Washington, D.C. voucher program came out, and for the first time actually found positive effects. The students who won these vouchers in a lottery are doing significantly better at school 2 years into the program than the students who lost out on that lottery. So it's kind of ironic that likely this is going to be a program that's going to be canceled, mainly for political reasons. Now, what about strengthening accountability systems? Again, I've pointed out that this is nothing new, but it's a very important part of the Obama agenda. So what do we know about accountability? Let me define it for you first. This is the way I would define accountability. First of all, each state has to write up a set of content standards indicating what students need to master in math and English and other subjects, grade by grade. So California has done this about a decade ago. Second, you need student testing at regular intervals to check whether students are actually mastering the content in those content standards. And then third, and most controversial, you want to back that up with interventions. When you find schools that are failing or individual students at schools who are not doing well, you need to intervene in some way to try to help those students or those schools get back up to par. And there might be consequences here for teachers and principals. No Child Left Behind, the federal legislation, does have a series of consequences for schools that are labeled failing. So that's one example. The state of California has its own accountability system that in some ways is actually superior to the federal system. It too has consequences for schools that are deemed as failing. So what do we know about the effect of these accountability systems? First of all, there are two different types of testing, really. There's low-stakes testing where there's really nothing at stake for the individual student, and then there's high-stakes testing where something is at stake. My reading of the research to date on the low-stakes testing is that simply testing students does not achieve much. It probably raises public awareness that there are huge gaps in achievement between one school and another, but it doesn't necessarily cause those low-performing schools to improve. What about high-stakes testing? And the idea here is that maybe a student is going to have to go to summer school if he or she doesn't perform well on the test, or will be retained a grade. Or in the case of the high school exit exam we have here in California, the student won't graduate from high school unless they pass this test. So how do students react to this? Well, here's one example of evidence that students really do start working harder when there's something at stake. This is from the report that Andy and I just published through the PPIC. And what this is showing is for the English language arts component of the CASE, passage rates and test scores. So this red line here is showing the passing score. You had to get a scaled score of 350 or higher to pass this test. And what you find is that the distribution of students is really skewed far to the right. Now, in part, this is just mechanical. Students who fail initially get multiple attempts, so you'd expect to see eventually a lot of those students passing. But I think there's clear implication here that something else is happening as well, which is that students who fail this test in grade 10, the first chance they had to take this test, this is a real wake-up call, and they work harder. There's been a statewide survey of students which has asked students who failed this in grade 10 what their response was, and a majority of students said that one of their reactions was to pay a lot more attention in class. So high-stakes testing probably can do something to at least focus students and presumably their teachers as well. Now, what about the idea that it's not enough simply to test, but to intervene? I think there's pretty good evidence from Chicago, which implemented summer school, in which students were strongly urged to attend summer school if their test scores were below a certain level. And there's a paper by Roderick, Jacob, and Breik indicating that summer school really boosted test scores. So that's an example of where testing and intervention, an expensive intervention, summer school is very expensive, really does work. We've put out a book through the PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California, where we looked at Alan Berson's reforms in San Diego Unified, the Blueprint for Student Success, and we found that in the lower grades, the interventions put in place, things like after-school reading programs, summer school, double or triple length English classes for students who are way behind in English language arts, really boosted achievement quite markedly. At the middle school level, the results were positive, not quite as strong as what we found at the elementary level. And the results didn't really support the reforms at the high school level. They seemed to backfire. We think for various reasons related to teacher buy-in at the high school level, and also the stigmatization that can really affect a 16 or 17-year-old being pulled out of class. This did not seem to backfire at the middle school or lower grade levels. So here in Chicago and San Diego, we have examples of how you can use testing in a diagnostic fashion, back it up with dollars for interventions for failing students. You really can help students. So things are not hopeless at all. Now, there's a flip side to accountability. A lot of people criticize accountability for stigmatizing students and for the negative effects it has on teachers and principals. So the first problem that a lot of people have pointed out is that this can really distort teacher incentives. For instance, it can cause entire school systems to spend more money on the subjects that are being tested and less money on the subjects that are not being tested. You could imagine a teacher doing that within a subject too, spending too much time on test prep rather than on core learning. And we need to be concerned about that, especially on the more superficial types of tests. There's another negative effect on teachers pointed out in a now famous paper by Jacob and Levitt, who looked at data from Chicago. And what we're showing here is from their paper, these are actual student responses on a multiple choice test in Chicago. And what Jacob and Levitt found is remarkable patterns where almost everybody in the class answered questions completely correctly. And student after student after student did this. And it's quite remarkable because if you look over here, you don't see any commonality whatsoever. So it's indicative to them that maybe somebody was either handing out answers or fixing the answers after. They also pointed out that a lot of these blocks of questions, which were answered correctly by an unusually large percentage of the students, often were the most difficult questions, which doesn't stand to reason. So they got permission from the superintendent to actually look at the scorecards and found a lot of erasures that matched up exactly with these blocks. So some teachers in Chicago lost their jobs over this. So this is not to knock accountability, it's just to say, let's not be naive about this. If you're going to implement high-stakes testing, you need to be very careful about the rules of the game and how the game is played. Brian Jacobs done some other very nice work where he's actually provided evidence that yes, indeed, school districts tend to reduce attention on subjects that are not tested regularly. So under No Child Left Behind, you have to test in reading and math grades 3 to 8 and one higher grade, and science in a couple of grades. So you can imagine the subjects that are being given short shrift here. He comes up with firm evidence that that is happening, and that's worrisome. He's also found that, at least in the schools he studied, there's evidence that teachers or principals proactively place students in special education to try to put them in a separate compartment and in some sense exempt them, or to do preemptive grade retention. So Johnny's going to do a bad job on the grade 5 test next year, so let's have Johnny repeat grade 4. Not necessarily a bad thing, but most of the research on grade retention shows it doesn't really help, might actually hurt. There's one study which has shown that grade retention actually can be quite effective if you not only make the student repeat the grade, but you provide that student with additional supports the second time around. Okay? So putting these things together, school choice in the guise of charter schools and school accountability, I don't think we can conclude from the research literature that either of these things is really a magic bullet. But done properly, school choice can help, and school accountability certainly can help. If it's backed up with more than just testing, it's backed up with additional spending for students who lag behind. Finally, on the Obama policy checklist, let's talk a little bit about the notion of teacher merit pay. As I mentioned at the outset of this talk, traditionally the way teachers have been paid in this country is a function of the collective bargaining agreement in their district, and pay moves up in entirely predictable fashion as the teacher gains experience in the district, as the teacher gets a master's degree and gains credentials. Okay, so maybe we could find different ways of paying people. We certainly don't pay university professors in this way. We pay them based on their productivity. Could we do that for teachers? So the question is, how do we measure teacher productivity? Well, we have an accountability system in every state now with testing. So a lot of people have been promoting the idea that what we need to do is to link those two things, student testing with merit pay for teachers. So the argument in favor I've already really explained, but just one statistic. This is from a paper by Corey Codell and myself. We measured teaching effectiveness in terms of test score gains of individual students. The upper bound on the percent of actual variation in teaching effectiveness that can be explained by the things that go into teachers' pay, such as education, credentials, and experience, is about 7%. So we're paying people in a way that's almost completely unrelated to how effective they appear to be in the classroom. So that's the argument in favor. We need to do something better than that. There are lots of arguments against teacher merit pay. So let me go through some of those. The first one I've already mentioned. What do we do about untested subjects, music, art, and so on? And I don't think anyone's got a really great solution to that right now. You could imagine classroom observation by principals being one route here, one partial solution. Another concern that I've heard a number of people voice is that paying individual teachers more if their students do well completely ignores the fact that teaching to some extent is a group activity. If you have a really good science teacher in high school, that science teacher may boost test scores for that student, and so you don't want to reward just the math teacher for that. So Corey, in his thesis, has a forthcoming paper on this, looked at this in the context of high schools, and he did find some evidence of spillovers, that science teachers help math scores and so on, but it's actually surprisingly limited. So you could imagine a revised form of teacher merit pay where schools are rewarded, or the math department is rewarded, or the science department is rewarded, but at the same time, individual teachers are rewarded as well. I'm going to be mentioning Corey's name a lot here. He's a recent graduate of our program, and last year he won a National Dissertation Award for Best Dissertation on Education Policy in the nation, so we're very proud of all the work that he's done on this. A third criticism of merit pay comes out of work done by Jesse Rothstein, who's at Princeton University. He came up with a quite remarkable and alarming finding. He tried to predict grade 3 test score gains as a function of who the grade 3 teacher was. Highly predictive. Some teachers are good and some are not. And then he got the idea, well, why don't I try to predict grade 3 gains in achievement as a function of who the future teacher will be next year in grade 4. And he found that the explanatory power of the future teachers was almost as good as explanatory power of the grade 3 teachers. That's obviously alarming because it suggests that there's something that's not causal going on here. And his explanation is there's sorting bias, that schools by and large tend to ability group. And so if a certain teacher, for instance by virtue of having a lot of tenure in the district, tends to get the students who learn most quickly, that teacher is going to be rewarded year after year for test score gains that aren't fully her responsibility. It's got to do with differences between the students she has and the students that the teacher next door might have. So Corey and I have just finished a paper where we tried to replicate Rothstein's results. He worked with data from North Carolina. We attempted to replicate this in the context of San Diego, which by the way does not have a merit pay system of this sort, but the district has been very generous in allowing us to do research studies. We could replicate his results almost exactly, and if anything, the problems were worse in San Diego. But then what we did was we asked, well, maybe we could make this problem go away by, instead of just focusing on one cohort of students that goes through grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, we use all the data available to us. And it turns out that if you use multiple classrooms over several years for a teacher, this problem completely goes away. So grade 4 teachers are no longer predictive of grade 3 outcomes. So a lot of people in talking about this as an arrow right in the heart of teacher merit pay, and we don't think it's a problem. Another issue that Corey and I have talked about is the idea of ceiling effects. And ceiling effects refer to, in a test, it's really quite low-level test, so a lot of students are getting 90% or 100%. There's not a lot of room for those students to grow from one year to the next, and you could imagine what's going to happen in a system like that, with a test like that. The teachers who have the best students are going to show very little growth, or maybe even losses. So we looked around the country, and one example we could find of a state that historically has had a very low-level test is Texas. It really is a minimum competency test, what Texas has had historically. And here's what the data look like in grades 3 and 4 in math. The dotted line here is our best attempt to overlay a normal or a bell curve on top of the data, and the blue line shows the actual distribution of students. And what you see is in grade 3, but even more on the right here, in grade 4, huge ceiling effects, that almost all the students are getting scores near the maximum. And sure enough, what we do is we take a data set where there aren't ceiling effects, we try to create ceiling effects like this. If you get ceiling effects as bad as Texas has, you are not going to have a reliable measure of teaching quality, and that is because the teachers who have the top scoring students look like they're not teaching at all, and that's not correct. But there's good news in this forthcoming paper in the sense that for a wide range of ceiling effects, if you're not doing as badly as Texas is, things are going to be okay. So on most of these things, I'm actually quite upbeat. There's one final concern I have, which I think is really serious, and that is the notion that maybe these measures of teaching effectiveness based on several dozen test scores for each teacher are going to be very volatile. And if the test scores and the measures of teaching effectiveness are going to be very, very volatile, so are the teachers when they find out that one year they're getting a reward and the next year they're not. So Corey and I have looked at this in the context of San Diego. What we did was to estimate teaching effectiveness using 3 years of data. And then we moved that window forward by 1 year. So instead of using data for these 3 years, we used a window like this. So 2/3 of the data are going to be exactly identical in these two studies. 2 out of 3 years are going to be identical test scores. And then what we did was we estimated teaching effectiveness. And we imagined what a state might do one day. Suppose they put teachers into 5 quintiles. So here, quintile 5 in year T-1 is going to be the top 5th of teachers. So you can imagine maybe giving merit pay to those teachers, and maybe a smaller bonus to teachers in the 4th quintile. And who knows what happens to teachers in the bottom quintile. There was one policy group on the East Coast that basically argued that we should be using these methods to identify bad teachers in their first 2 years and fire them. So let's look at this carefully. Maybe that's the policy experiment. So what we're going to do here in this table is to show you the rankings here using year T-1 data and what happens when you use year T data. And ideally what you'd want is 100% of teachers to be on these diagonal cells. So in other words, 100% of teachers who are identified as being in the top 20% in the first study should also be in the top 5th in the second study. What do the data actually look like? They look very different from that, as you can see. In no case do we get anything even approaching half of teachers being listed in the same quintile of performance from one year to the next. So for example, 35% of the so-called best teachers using the earlier study are also listed as the best teachers the next time around, but 13% move from being in the best 5th to the bottom 5th. So you can imagine a radical teacher merit pay program that was based solely on measures like this. How would you explain it to teachers when one year they won a $10,000 award for being the top 5th of teachers district-wide, the next year they were fired for being in the bottom 20%? So this is the biggest concern that I have about using test scores for teacher merit pay. So the bottom line here is that we do think that using student test score gain should be a part of merit pay, but it's obviously not the only answer. And we need supplemental measures of teaching effectiveness, such as classroom observation by principals or by master teachers. Putting these things together in some way, I think, could really move us forward. So getting back to the original themes of this talk, hope and change in education, I think incrementally there is hope and there is change. The hope here is primarily limited by the fact that We are in a very severe recession, and on top of that, and even more fundamentally, federal spending on K-12 is about 9% in a typical year of overall K-12 spending. There's only so much you can do by playing around with that 9%. How much change are we actually going to see in education policy in K-12? I've made the point, I hope successfully, that in terms of accountability, we're going to see some tweaks and some improvements, but nothing radical. We're seeing some quite dramatic changes in other areas, improvements in college financial aid, which is a terrific idea, and a shift away from vouchers to attend private schools in favor of expanded funding for charter schools. So let me stop there and take your questions.
Thank you, Julian, for a very knowledgeable and informative talk. Do we have a moving microphone? So if, before you speak, if you could wait till the microphone comes to you so that we can all hear the question, and I'll let Julian run the show.
Thanks, Jim.
In terms of Obama's promise for education being affordable, he talked last week about having direct loans from the government instead of the banks, and also about possible service and trade for each year that the kid goes to college, that the government would allow them to be able to pay back. Can you say more about that? Because that really is the hope of whether kids can go to college financially.
Right. Of those two reforms, I think the hot button issue is whether the private sector should be involved in federal aid. And you can see this being bandied about in Washington already. I think this is rather unfortunate. I think people in the middle of the political spectrum could see the case for having the private sector furnish this money or have the government take over. You can see both sides of the equation. The real reason, I think, for why the Obama administration is pushing for having the government itself issue all these loans rather than the private sector is there have been a number of scandals nationwide where some of these private loaners were trying to get the business of a given campus, and it turned out they were giving paybacks to university administrators. Now, I'm all in favor of increased pay for university administrators. I just became one in July, but this is not the right way to do it. So I think for that reason, I think there are very strong feelings on one side of the aisle in Washington that we need the government to directly disperse those. I don't know that it's going to make a big difference in the end, because these cases of kickbacks were really few, and it was a fairly rare instance. The service versus aid thing, I think, is potentially a good idea. We know that a lot of people don't even apply to college because their parents can see no way of paying for it. And so I think that could be a good idea, at least for some subpopulation of the U.S. population. 50-50, I'd say.
I was horrified when I read in the newspaper 2 or 3 days ago that various teachers are getting layoff notices, including several teachers of the year because they were young, and one brand new teacher who commuted 90 minutes to Borrego Springs and did a couple of hours a day extra work and was an outstanding teacher. He was a first-year teacher, so out he's supposed to go. Something's wrong when that situation happens. What do you suggest?
Well, I think you just answered your own question. That really tenure and the specifications of collective bargaining agreements really dictate that if there are going to be layoffs, it's going to be the least experienced teachers who go first. And there is some evidence nationwide that teachers who are beyond about year 2 or year 3 of teaching do tend to be more effective in the classroom than teachers in their first year or 2 or maybe first 3 years. Beyond that, it's really hard to detect any systematic effect of teacher experience. And so this is very problematic. You could lay off one highly experienced teacher or 2 less experienced teachers and save the same amount of money. So I don't know that I have the wisdom to really come up with a better system, but you could imagine if we could come up with a teacher merit pay system that used not just the test scores approach, which I've talked about, but also classroom observation by other teachers or by principal. If we melded those two, and got buy-in from teacher unions, you could imagine that perhaps being used as a way to decide who should be laid off first. That would be a complete sea change in the way we hire, retain, and fire teachers in this country, though.
One of the arguments that I've heard said about our education system that you didn't really talk about is that you have a selection bias in who becomes a teacher because of the pay and the structure of compensation that comes along with being a teacher. And so you're essentially not often getting the best and the brightest, but rather someone who's willing to make a sacrifice in order to take that job. Could you comment a little on that?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of evidence in support of what you're saying. There's some excellent work by Carolyn Hawksby, now at Stanford, and some co-authors, which basically argues that public schools in this country had a free ride for many decades in this country because of the glass ceiling, which prevented talented women from going into medicine and law and so on. Of course, that glass ceiling is now shattered. And she comes up with fairly convincing evidence that a result of that is that the average, for lack of a better word, ability of teachers really started to fall in the mid-1960s as opportunities opened up for women in other areas. And what's the answer to that? The answer is, in certain areas, such as science and math, we need to think about what the market wage is. This is what the private sector does. This is what universities do as well when we're competing for the best professors. You pay market salaries. So for someone just coming out of a math program or a science program at a public university, teaching is an option, but it's very poorly paid compared to the wages that these people could get in private industry. So there is a movement afoot, which I think has some bipartisan support, for really opening that up and for paying extra to teachers in certain fields, especially science and math, where the wage gaps seem to be really the greatest. The teachers' unions on the whole have been opposed to this, and you can understand why. They tend to be one for all and all for one. But it seems to be ignoring market realities.
You commented briefly on the school choice, on the voucher schools in Washington, and the apparent disgrace about what's going to happen in terms of burying that program. And I've not had the privilege of reading any of your books on vouchers, but would you spend a little more time discussing your view of how effective it is, and maybe whether you see any possible way in which it can get implemented more broadly in this country?
The biggest barrier to vouchers is really state constitutions, which tend to have separation of church and state provisions in them. So I just don't see that in the next 10 or 15 years a widespread system of student vouchers really becoming prevalent. And that's because most private schools in this country at present are religious schools. So that's one just practical barrier. I was getting calls from the Wall Street Journal asking me about the DC program, I think because I'm on the technical review panel, and we couldn't say anything about it. We knew the results, but the results were only released a couple of weeks ago. And I just don't know what's going to happen in Washington. I think the majority is going to vote against extending that program. Now, how big of a disaster is this? Well, in the first couple of years, the studies really didn't find a big effect of winning one of these vouchers at all. It was only really in the final year of the program, and the effects are modest. So again, we shouldn't be thinking of school vouchers as a magic bullet that's going to solve all the ills and narrow the achievement gap between black and white and between Hispanic and white. That's just not the case, but there's some evidence that vouchers may work. Now, there are all sorts of different school choice programs as well. Probably the most cited study of school choice systems in the last 5 years was co-authored by my next-door neighbor in the Department of Economics, Julian, who's used lottery data from Chicago and found no academic gains from winning lotteries in that city. We've put out a book looking at school choice in San Diego. We've found that these programs are wildly popular with parents. They're all heavily oversubscribed. We didn't find big effects of entering one of these school choice programs, at least in terms of reading and math achievement. The exception was magnet schools, where at the high school level, lottery winners 3 years out were doing significantly better than students who lost the lottery. And charter schools we found were doing about the same in San Diego. Our most recent evidence, which I showed you earlier using data from '02 through '06, suggest that charter schools are outperforming traditional public schools in San Diego now, but by a fairly modest amount. So the problem is we can't find one thing we can do that would dramatically improve public education, but that's not a sufficient grounds for pessimism. I think there are a bunch of little things we can do which would together make a huge difference.
I'm interested in two areas. One is simply the difference between reporting group statistic data versus actual absolute skill level by grade level. And they have their pluses and minuses, but one without the other sometimes is misleading.
Right.
And the other is, have you looked at the response to intervention framework for reorganizing schools and the effects of those programs?
Okay, so I'll repeat the questions in case some of you at the back couldn't hear as best I can. So the first question was, what's the better way of measuring student achievement in relative terms or in terms of absolute performance versus content standards? That's a great question. We've tried it both ways in California. The advantage of measuring things against an absolute standard is that you really can objectively report what percentage of grade 4 students have mastered the math content on the standards. The federal No Child Left Behind program essentially does that. You hear much talk every year about which schools are making adequate yearly progress. What that really means is, are X% of students at this school proficient in math and reading? And each year, California is now increasing the percentage of students who need to be proficient for that school to be deemed to be making adequate yearly progress. Results are entirely predictable. The schools that are deemed failing are the ones in the least affluent sections of the city. And so focusing just on absolute levels is useful because it tells us, gives us a useful yardstick about how far students need to go to become proficient, but it's entirely inadequate for measuring gains. And the pre-existing state accountability system was actually more effective in that regard because they deemed a school successful if it made up some of the gap between where its average test scores were and the ultimate goal, which in California is to have an academic performance index of 800 or more for every school. So that's a better measure. And I think, as I've tried to point out, you really want to measure these things at the student level. We do things like compare grade 3 test scores at your local school this year to grade 3 test scores last year. That might say something about whether the school is improving, but more often what it's telling us is whether the mix of students in this year's grade 3 class is different from the mix of students who were there the year before. And then your second question had to do with systemic reform to how we run schools. Well, I'm an economist, not a political scientist, but I think political scientists do have some things to say about this. There's an argument to be made in favor of school choice, and the argument is essentially this. In a really, really large school district, for that school district to be doing the best thing, the optimal thing for every single family, it needs to know those families' preferences and the students' needs, strengths, and weaknesses. It's extremely hard for the central administration in a really large school district to gather information about that. Giving more control to local schools as to how they spend money, the ways they teach, while holding them accountable, giving everyone the same bar they have to reach, to jump over, to be deemed a successful school might be a much better way to go than the way we've been doing things historically. There's been one move in that direction, partly precipitated by the budget crisis in Sacramento, namely that traditionally the way the state has funded schools is through a series of over 100 categorical programs for special education, for tutoring for students who haven't passed the high school exit exam. In the most recent budget, the state decided to take a lot of these categories of funding and pool them together. And that was done largely for pragmatic reasons, as far as I can tell. But I think this could be extremely beneficial to individual schools and school districts, because now those districts have a bit more say about how to spend money, instead of always trying to spend, X dollars on this and Y dollars on that. One shoe size does not fit all. We need different approaches for different types of students, and I think that would be one welcome reform.
Here's another political science question for you.
Thank you.
Do you think that top administrators at the federal level can actually help bring about change, and what is your assessment of the Secretary of Education Obama's basketball playing friend.
Oh, I believe in the bully pulpit entirely. I think No Child Left Behind, it has a lot of flaws in the way it declares whether a school is succeeding or failing, absolutely, and it can be improved, but I'm convinced that legislation forced a number of laggard states that hadn't created accountability standards yet to introduce testing. The tests have been improved in most of the states over the last 4 years, and that's because of No Child Left Behind and some of the provisions that the federal government really forced upon states. So it's true that the federal government in a typical year only accounts for about 9% of funding, but they do have leverage, and I didn't mean to entirely minimize that. So I think the leadership, both in terms of the President and the Secretary of Education, who's a very forward-looking person as far as I can tell, can really have a big impact if they push for the right things in a very concentrated, consistent way.
Hi, I think I heard you say that parental participation has high leverage in educational outcomes, and I'm wondering if there's a way to measure parental participation and also to incentivize parental participation based on that.
That's a great question, and it's hard to know exactly how to do that. Some parents are just entirely into this and other parents are not. And sometimes for no fault of the parents themselves. If you're a low-income parent, you might be working 2 jobs at once, and the idea of showing up for a bake sale at school is really almost impossible. So that's a real issue. I think parental participation does play a big role in improving schools. If parents understand what's going on in a school, that can really help. A lot of schools around the nation have drawn up contracts where parents basically assign a contract committing to do certain things. And charter schools in particular are very good at doing this. Beyond that, I don't have any particularly bright ideas on how to compel parents to participate. I think it has to be voluntary participation that comes from the heart. That's the sort of participation that really helps schools. Thank you.
Thanks again for a very informative presentation, Julian.
Okay.